Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 1. The Mask of Gaiety. The music, they would all later agree, was the last truly beautiful thing they heard before the world turned upside down. It was a shimmering cascade of saxophone and piano, floating through the opulent ballroom of Blackwater Manor, a grand and isolated estate on the banks of the Thames. And beneath the music, the rustle of silk, the murmur of laughter, the clink of champagne flutes, a symphony of privilege and pleasure. It was the night of the autumn masquerade, an event presided over by the formidable and fabulously wealthy Sir Reginald Blackwater, a man who collected rare artifacts and, it seemed, interesting people. And in the midst of this swirling kaleidoscope of color and sound, a single, neat figure stood as a bastion of order. He did not dance. He did not mingle. He observed. His egg-shaped head was bare. His famous moustaches waxed to a perfection that defied the frivolity around him. This was Hercule Poirot, and he was, as he would later confess, profoundly uneasy. He had been invited not as a mere guest, but as a curious favor to an old friend from the Belgian police, now in Sir Reginald's employ. "Keep an eye on things," Poirot, the man had said. "The old man has been receiving unpleasant letters. Nothing specific, just malice. At an event like this, with so many masks, who knows what might happen?" And so Poirot watched. He saw the host, Sir Reginald, a bull of a man in the costume of a Roman emperor, his face a mask of joviality that did not quite reach his tired eyes. He saw his wife, the ethereal Lady Celia, a decade his junior, draped as a Greek nymph, her laughter a little too high, her movements a little too frantic. She was, Poirot noted, never far from the side of the dashing Mr. Julian Fry, a portrait painter costumed as a Venetian gondolier, whose gaze lingered on her with a possessive intensity that spoke of more than professional interest. Then there were the rest of the party, the sharp-tongued dowager, Mrs. Templeton, swayed in feathers as macaw, her eyes missing nothing. The nervous young secretary, Arthur Digby, his harlequin costume seeming to hang awkwardly on his thin frame, his eyes constantly darting towards his employer, Sir Reginald. The American industrialist, J.P. Croft, a blustering King Henry VIII, talking loudly of mergers and acquisitions. And the enigmatic Russian exile, Madame Petrova, a dramatic figure in a black domino and lace, who spoke in low, husky tones and seemed to know a secret about everyone present. Poirot's fastidious soul rebelled against the chaos of the masks. It was an offense to the order of the universe. How can one read a face, a twitch of the lip, a flicker of the eye, when it is all hidden behind silk and paste? A mask, he reasoned, does not merely conceal identity. It grants a license to the shadow self. It invites the darkness within to come out and play. It was during the unmasking at midnight, a tradition Sir Reginald insisted upon with a theatrical flourish, that the first crack appeared. As the guests removed their masks with laughter and shrieks of surprise, a sudden, strangled gasp cut through the merriment. Lady Celia, her nymph's mask in her hand, was staring at her husband. The jovial Roman emperor was gone. In his place was a man rigid with shock, his face ashen. He was staring at a small, folded piece of paper that had apparently been slipped into the golden belt of his toga. His hand trembled as he picked it up, unfolded it, and read it. A single, violent shudder passed through his large frame. Without a word to his wife, he crumpled the paper, turned on his heel, and strode from the ballroom, his face a thundercloud. The party stumbled on, but the spark had gone out of it. The music felt forced. An hour later, as the guests began to retire, it was a quiet Mr. Digby who, his voice tight with anxiety, approached Poirot. "Monsieur Poirot, it is probably nothing, but Sir Reginald retired to his study over an hour ago. He gave strict instructions. He was not to be disturbed, but he has a pressing telephone call to London booked for now. I knocked, but there was no answer." The knot of unease in Poirot's stomach tightened. He accompanied the young secretary to the heavy oak door of Sir Reginald's first-floor study. Digby knocked again, louder this time. "Sir Reginald? Your call, sir." Silence. Poirot's eyes met the secretary's. He tried the handle. The door was locked. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, began to bloom in Poirot's chest. He motioned for Digby to step back. With a strength that belied his small stature, Poirot threw his shoulder against the door near the lock. The old wood splintered with crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent hall. The scene within was one of grotesque contrast. The study was a testament to masculine comfort. Leather chairs, walls of books, the faint, sweet smell of pipe tobacco and old brandy. Sir Reginald Blackwater was seated in his high-backed chair behind his large mahogany desk. He was still in his Roman emperor's costume, but the golden laurel wreath was askew, and his head was thrown back, his eyes wide with what could only be described as terminal surprise. The handle of an ornate, jeweled dagger, a piece Poirot recognized from Sir Reginald's own collection of antiquities displayed in the ballroom, protruded from the center of his chest. The murder weapon was not the only shocking detail. The killer had left a final, mocking message. Placed carefully upon the murdered man's chest, covering the fatal wound, was a single white mask. It was completely blank, devoid of features, expressionless. It was the most terrifying mask of the evening. Poirot took a deep breath, his mind already shifting from observer to hunter. The symphony of the ball was over. Now began the meticulous, painstaking work of untangling the discordant notes of a life brutally ended. The masks were off, but the true faces of the guests at Blackwater Manor were more hidden than ever. The door to the study was now open, and a new, darker chapter had begun. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 2, The Order of Chaos. For a long moment, there was only silence in the shattered doorway. Arthur Digby made a small, choked sound, like a wounded animal, his hand flying to his mouth. The harlequin costume, so festive moments before, now seemed a garish mockery in the face of death. Poirot, however, did not gasp or exclaim, his entire being focused, compressing the world into the confines of the study. The horror of the scene was not ignored, but it was immediately subordinated to the greater imperative, order. Murder was the ultimate chaos, and Hercule Poirot's life's work was to impose reason upon it. He held out an arm, barring the secretary's entrance. "Remain here, Monsieur Digby. Do not touch anything. Do not let anyone enter. You understand? The sanctity of the scene, it is everything." Digby could only nod, his face a pale moon in the dim hall light. Poirot stepped inside, closing the broken door as best he could behind him. The air was thick, stale. He moved with a deliberate, quiet precision, his eyes missing nothing, cataloguing everything. He approached the desk. Sir Reginald was undeniably dead. Poirot did not need to check for a pulse, but he observed the details with a clinical detachment. The position of the body, slumped back in the chair. The angle of the dagger, a single, brutal thrust upward, under the breastbone, a blow requiring significant force or desperate knowledge. The lack of any sign of a struggle. The desk blotter was perfectly aligned, a pen set straight beside it. A half-finished glass of brandy sat to the right, untouched. It suggested surprise, a swift attack from someone he did not fear, or perhaps from someone he had expected, but from whom he had expected words, not violence. Then, the mask, the blank, white mask. Poirot leaned close, but he did not touch it. It was a simple domino mask, the kind held on a stick, but utterly plain, a void of white plaster. It had been placed with care, centered on the chest, directly over the wound. It was a message, a signature. It spoke of contempt, of a killer who saw their victim as a faceless entity, or perhaps of a killer who felt themselves to be faceless, a mere instrument of vengeance. It was theatrical, cruel, and deeply psychological. His gaze swept the room. The windows were locked from the inside, the heavy velvet curtains drawn. The only door was the one he had just forced open, locked from the inside with a heavy bolt. A classic locked room. But Poirot's lips thinned. He did not believe in impenetrable boxes. He believed in the cleverness of the human animal, and its propensity for creating illusions. His eyes fell upon the hearth. A fire had been laid but not lit, and there, nestled against a log, was a small, crumpled ball of paper. The note, the one Sir Reginald had read before his death. Using the tip of his own silver pen, Poirot carefully fished it out, smoothing it on the leather surface of the desk. The message was short, composed of words cut from a newspaper and glued to the sheet. It read, "Your false crown hides a rotten core. The past comes to collect its debt. Expect a reckoning tonight. The past, a debt." The words were generic, the stuff of 1,000 anonymous threats, yet they had clearly struck a mortal chord in Sir Reginald. What specific past? What debt? The false crown was an obvious reference to his Roman emperor costume, but Poirot sensed a deeper meaning. Sir Reginald's wealth, his title, his entire empire, was it built on a rotten core? He pocketed the note carefully. The scene had yielded its initial secrets. Now, it was time for the people. He opened the door to find Digby still standing sentinel, trembling. Down the hall, a few curious faces had gathered, drawn by the noise of the breaking door. The blustering J.P. Croft, the sharp-eyed Mrs. Templeton, and the anxious Lady Celia, still in her nymph's gown. "Madam," Poirot said to Lady Celia, his voice low and grave, "you must be brave. There's been a tragedy. Your husband is dead." Her cry was piercing, a genuine sound of shock that echoed in the hall. She swayed, and Julian Fry, who had appeared behind her, caught her arm. His face was pale, his artist's eyes wide. "Dead!" Croft boomed. "Reginald? How?" "He has been murdered," Poirot stated flatly. The word hung in the air, sucking the oxygen from the corridor. "I must ask everyone to return to the main drawing room. No one is to leave this house. The telephone lines will be monitored. The local police have been summoned." This last part was a bluff, but a necessary one to establish control. He turned to Arthur Digby. "Monsieur Digby, you will secure this door. No one enters but the police. Then you will come to the drawing room. We must all speak." The next hour was a masterclass in controlled chaos. The grand drawing room of Blackwater Manor, so recently a place of laughter and music, was now a gilded cage. Shock, fear, and suspicion hung like a pall over the assembled guests. Poirot stood before the fireplace, a small, tidy figure radiating an immense, unshakable authority. He began not with accusations, but with chronology. He needed to establish the movement of everyone after the unmasking at midnight. It was a tangled web. Lady Celia, supported by Julian Fry, claimed she had retired to her room shortly after her husband's abrupt departure, distraught by his behavior. She had seen no one. Julian Fry corroborated this, saying he had escorted her to her door and then gone straight to his own room to smoke and think. He had heard nothing. J.P. Croft declared he had been in the billiard room with Madame Petrova, discussing business, and, he added with a faint leer, other things. They had both been there until the commotion. Madame Petrova, her dramatic black lace still in place, confirmed this with a slow nod. Her dark eyes watched Poirot with a calm, almost amused intensity. Mrs. Templeton, the macaw, stated she had been in the library, seeking a quiet moment. She claimed to have seen Arthur Digby pacing in the main hall around 12:30, looking most agitated. Digby, when questioned, stammered that this was true. He had been worried about Sir Reginald and the missed telephone call. He admitted to going to the study door once, hearing nothing, and retreating. He claimed he had then gone to the kitchen for a warm drink, a fact the tired kitchen maid, when summoned, weakly verified. It was a collection of alibis, fragile and interlocking. Everyone had an account. No one had a perfect witness for the entire time. The house was large, its corridors dark and winding. It would have been possible for almost anyone to slip away. Poirot listened, his hands folded over his waistcoat. He was not yet interested in breaking these stories. He was allowing them to be built, so he could later find the cracks in their foundations. His questions then turned to the past. The anonymous note. The debt. He watched their faces carefully. Lady Celia grew paler, insisting she knew nothing of her husband's business affairs or his past troubles. Julian Fry became defensive. Reginald was a hard man. He made enemies in business, of course. But this is a work of a madman. J.P. Croft blustered about the cutthroat nature of commerce, but offered nothing specific. It was Madame Petrova who provided the first, tantalizing clue. She spoke in her low, accented voice. Sir Reginald, he was not always a pillar of English society. No, there were rumors from his youth. A partnership, long ago, that ended badly. In South Africa, before the war, there was a man, his name, I cannot recall, but he felt betrayed, ruined, it was said. A betrayed partner from South Africa, a rotten core, the past coming to collect. Poirot stored the information away, a single new piece in a vast, empty puzzle. He dismissed them then, instructing them to remain in their rooms. As they filed out, a picture was beginning to form in his mind, not of a person, but of a pattern. The locked room, the stolen dagger, the cryptic note, the blank mask. It was all so deliberate, so staged. The killer was not just a murderer. They were a playwright, a producer, a scene designer. They were intelligent, and they hated Sir Reginald Blackwater with a cold, theatrical passion that went beyond mere profit or revenge. The storm had broken over Blackwater Manor, and as the first grey light of dawn began to touch the windows, Hercule Poirot knew one thing with absolute certainty. The killer was still among them, hiding behind the most effective mask of all, the mask of innocence. The investigation was no longer a matter of finding a culprit. It was a duel of wits against a mind of devious and creative cruelty. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 3, a web of threads. The dawn broke over Blackwater Manor, a grey and sombre affair that did little to lift the pall of dread hanging over the house. The local constabulary, a stout, pragmatic inspector named Prescott, and his younger, keen-eyed sergeant, had arrived, taken one look at Poirot's credentials in the scene, and with a mixture of relief and resentment, ceded the formal investigation to the famous detective. Poirot, in turn, was gracious, knowing the value of local knowledge and official authority. He had them secure the study, photograph a body, and begin the tedious process of fingerprinting the room and the dagger, a process he knew would likely yield nothing but the smudged impressions of a dozen guests and servants. While they worked, Poirot embarked on his own, more subtle form of investigation. He began not with the people, but with the spaces between them. He moved through the house, a quiet, observant ghost, reconstructing the piles taken hours before. He stood in the grand hall, imagining Arthur Digby pacing on the black and white marble tiles, his anxiety a tangible thing. He walked the corridor from the drawing-room to the study, noting the long, heavy carpet that muffled footsteps. He paused at Lady Celia's door, then at Julian Fry's, calculating the distance, the lines of sight. He visited the billiard-room, where Croft and Petrova claimed their alibi, noting the thick green baize of the table, the smoky air, the second door that led out into a side garden vestibule. He spent a full 10 minutes in the library, where Mrs. Templeton claimed to have sought solace, his eyes tracing the shelves, the tall, wheeled ladder, the deep, comfortable chairs that could easily conceal a seated figure. It was in the library that he found his first tangible thread. Tucked not on a shelf, but behind a large globe on a stand near the fireplace, was a small, sharp pair of embroidery scissors, and caught in the hinge of the blades was a single, long, vibrant blue feather, the exact shade of the macaw costume worn by Mrs. Templeton. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Had the sharp-tongued dowager been telling less than the truth? Why would she hide a pair of scissors? Were they connected to the murder? The dagger was a weapon, not scissors. But the note had been composed of words cut from a newspaper. Carefully, using his handkerchief, he retrieved the scissors and slipped them into his pocket. It was a small thing, a loose thread, but in Poirot's experience, pulling on such threads could sometimes unravel an entire tapestry. His next port of call was the kitchen, where he found the sleepy maid who had served Digby his warm milk. She was a simple, honest girl, terrified by the events. Yes, she confirmed, Mr. Digby had been there, very shaken. But he had not been alone for the entire time. He had received a telephone call. A call? To the kitchen extension. Poirot asked, his interest sharpening. Yes, sir. Rang about 1:10. It did. He took it, went ever so quiet, and then rushed out right after, saying he had to check on Sir Reginald again. That was the last I saw of him before all the shouting started. A telephone call. To the secretary, in the kitchen, moments before the body was discovered. Who had called, and why? It placed Digby's final approach to the study in a new, more urgent light. Was he summoned, or was the call a part of some other scheme? Armed with these new fragments, Poirot began his first proper interviews, starting with the most fragile link, Arthur Digby. He found the secretary in his small, neat sitting room, hunched in a chair, looking utterly depleted. The harlequin costume was gone, replaced by a sober suit, but the memory of it seemed to cling to him, a reminder of the evening's grotesque turn. Monsieur Digby, Poirot began, seating himself opposite the young man. "Let us speak plainly. You were more than a secretary to Sir Reginald, were you not?" Digby looked up, startled. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do. You have the look of him, around the eyes, the set of the jaw. It is faint, but it is there. You are his natural son, perhaps?" The young man crumpled. The pretense fell away, and he nodded, a single, miserable to tracing a path down his cheek. "Yes, no one knew, not even Lady Celia. He acknowledged me, gave me a position, but he was ashamed. He said it would complicate things, ruin his standing." "And you are content with this? To be so close, yet forever in the shadows? What choice did I have?" Digby's voice was bitter. "He supported my mother until she died. This was his settlement. A job, a roof, but no name, no recognition." "And the telephone call you received in the kitchen? Who was it?" Digby paled further. I don't know. A voice I didn't recognize. Muffled. It said, he knows everything. The truth will be out tonight. You will be exposed." Then they hung up. I thought it was about me, about our relationship. I thought he was going to disown me publicly. I had to confront him. Poirot studied him. It was a plausible story, full of the raw nerve of a hidden shame. But it was also a perfectly convenient excuse for rushing to the study of a man who was about to be murdered. The call could have been a ruse, designed to make Digby the one to discover the body, casting immediate suspicion upon him. Next, Poirot sought out Mrs. Templeton. He found her in the morning room, sipping tea with an impressive show of composure. The macaw costume was gone, but her sharp eyes missed nothing. "Madam," Poirot said, coming straight to the point. He held up the embroidery scissors, dangling from his handkerchief. "I believe these are yours? I found them in the library, behind the globe." For a fraction of a second, her composure flickered. Then she sniffed. "I wondered where I'd misplaced those. The clasp was loose. I must have dropped them." "And the feather? The blue feather, from your costume? It was caught in the hinge." Her eyes hardened. "Is that an accusation, Monsieur Poirot? I was in the library, as I said. I was repairing a loose sequin on my mask. The feather must have drifted from my costume. It is hardly a capital offense." "But you did not mention using scissors," Poirot pressed gently. "Scissors that could cut paper such as that used for an anonymous note." Mrs. Templeton set her cup down with a sharp click. "I did not compose any notes. I cut a thread. Nothing more. If you are suggesting I had anything to do with Reginald's death, you are profoundly mistaken. I found him boorish, but he was a pillar of the community. His death benefits no one." Her denial was swift and sure. Yet, Poirot thought, she had the nerve for it. The intelligence, and the scissors, hidden, suggested a desire to conceal something. His final interview of the morning was with J.P. Croft. The American bluster had been replaced by a watchful tension. He agreed to speak in the billiard room. "Mr. Croft," Poirot began, "your business with Sir Reginald. It was not merely social, I think." Croft lit a cigar, taking his time. "No, it wasn't. We were negotiating a merger. Blackwater's shipping interests with my American steel. It would have created a transatlantic empire. And were the negotiations amicable?" Croft's jaw tightened. Reginald was a tough negotiator, driving a hard bargain. "Last night, before the ball, we had words. He was trying to squeeze me out, lower the price at the last minute. I told him I wouldn't be played for a fool." "A motive, some might say," Poirot suggested softly. "A motive for a broken deal. Maybe. Not for murder," Croft retorted, blowing out a cloud of smoke. "Killing him scuttles the whole thing. It's bad for business. Besides, Madame Petrova can vouch for me. We were together all evening after the unmasking." "Were you?" Poirot asked, his head tilted. "The billiard room has 2 doors, does it not? And the human bladder, it has its demands. A few minutes here, a few minutes there. Alibis are like Swiss cheese, Monsieur Croft. They are full of holes." He left the American scowling into his cigar smoke. The threads were multiplying. A secret son, a shamed heir, a sharp-eyed widow with hidden scissors and a missing feather, a frustrated businessman with a crumbling alibi. And all the while, the central, haunting enigma remained: the locked room, the stolen dagger, the blank mask. Poirot returned to his own room, standing by the window to look out at the manicured gardens. He felt the presence of the other guests, their secrets pressing in on him. Lady Celia and her devoted painter, Julian Fry. The enigmatic Madame Petrova with her tales of a ruined partner from South Africa. Each had a piece of the puzzle, a fragment of the truth. But the picture they formed was not yet clear. The killer had not just committed a crime. They had woven a web of false trails and psychological misdirection. And Hercule Poirot knew that to find the spider at the center, he would have to follow each and every thread to its end, no matter how tangled the path became. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 4. The Portrait of a Liar. The morning wore on, a slow, suffocating blanket of tension smothering Blackwater Manor. Hercule Poirot, having gathered his initial threads, now turned his attention to the heart of the household's emotional landscape, Lady Celia Blackwater and the man who was so clearly her devoted shadow, Julian Fry. He requested to speak with them separately, in the small, sunlit morning room, hoping the clear light of day might reveal what the shadows of the ballroom had concealed. Lady Celia arrived first, supported by a maid. She was a picture of tragic beauty, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed. She moved with a fragile grace that seemed to suggest she might shatter at the slightest touch. She was draped in a simple black dress, a stark contrast to the ethereal nymph of the previous night. "Madam," Poirot began, his voice gentle but firm, "please accept my sincerest condolences. This is a terrible shock. I must, however, ask you some questions. The future demands it." She nodded weakly, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I understand, Monsieur Poirot. I will try to help. Let us speak of the note your husband received, the one that so disturbed him. Had he spoken to you of any threats? Any unpleasantness from his past?" A faint tremor passed over her features. "Reginald, he was a very private man. He did not burden me with his business worries. He liked to present a strong front. But these last few weeks he had been preoccupied, short-tempered. He mentioned nothing specific, but I knew something was weighing on him." "And what of his past?" "Madame Petrova mentioned a partnership long ago in South Africa. Does this mean anything to you?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of something. Fear? Recognition, before the veil of grief descended again. South Africa? He never spoke of it. He never spoke of his life before we met. It was a closed book. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And your own relationship with Mr. Julian Fry? It is one of artist and patron, is it not?" The color in her cheeks heightened ever so slightly. "Julian, Mr. Fry, is a brilliant painter. He has been commissioned to do my portrait. We have spent many hours together in the studio. He is a great comfort, a sympathetic soul. A comfort that your husband approved of?" Poirot inquired, his tone neutral. She looked away, towards a window. Reginald did not understand the artistic temperament. He thought it all a frivolous waste of time. There were words, but it was nothing. Truly. Poirot sensed the evasion. Her grief was real, but it was layered over a foundation of other, more complex emotions. Fear, perhaps, and a deep-seated resentment. He moved on, asking for a precise account of her movements after retiring to her room. Her story was unchanged. She had gone straight to bed, heard nothing, seen nothing. It was a simple, unverifiable alibi. The alibi of someone who had been, effectively, alone. When Julian Fry entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. The Venetian gondolier was gone, replaced by a man in a paint-smocked smock and tailored trousers, the very image of the Bohemian artist. But his confidence was brittle. His eyes, which Poirot noted were a remarkable shade of green, darted around the room before settling on the detective with a forced calm. "Monsieur Fry," Poirot began, "you were close to the family." I was their portrait painter," Fry corrected himself, his voice tight, "and a close confidant of Lady Celia, it seems. Tell me, what was the nature of the words you had with Sir Reginald?" Fry's jaw tightened. He was a Philistine. He thought art was a decoration for the wealthy. He did not understand the process, the intimacy it requires. He accused me of overstepping. I told him my intentions were purely professional, that my only interest was in capturing her ladyship's spirit on canvas. And were they? Purely professional. Poirot let the question hang in the air. I resent your implication, Monsieur Poirot, Fry said, his voice rising. My relationship with Lady Celia is one of mutual respect and artistic understanding. Nothing more. And yet, you were quick to escort her to her room, to offer comfort. And your own alibi for the time of the murder is, like Hayes, unverifiable. You were in your room, smoking and thinking. A solitary pursuit. It is the truth, Fry insisted, a flush of anger on his cheeks. I had no reason to harm Reginald. His patronage was important to me. Was it? Poirot asked softly. Or was his absence perhaps more important? A removal of an obstacle. Fry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I will not sit here and be accused. I have nothing more to say to you. He stormed out, leaving a charged silence in his wake. Poirot did not move. The reaction was telling. It was the anger of a guilty man, or perhaps merely the pride of an innocent one who felt besmirched. It was another thread, tangled and knotted. His next move was a calculated risk. He asked Inspector Prescott to gather all the guest luggage and personal effects for a search. There was protest, of course. J.P. Croft was loudly indignant about the sanctity of his private papers. Madame Petrova was icily dismissive, and Mrs. Templeton declared it a shocking invasion. But Poirot was insistent. The killer had prepared for this night. There might be traces, glue, scraps of newspaper, a duplicate mask. While his order were being carried out, he sought out Madame Petrova once more. He found her in the conservatory amidst a jungle of exotic plants, looking perfectly at home. Madame Petrova, he said, you mentioned a partner from South Africa. I would be most interested if you could try to remember the name. The past, it holds a key, I am sure of it. She gave him a slow, enigmatic smile. The memory, it is a fragile thing, Monsieur Poirot. It was so long ago. A name, it dances on the tip of the tongue. Van something, Van der Merwe, or perhaps it was a Scottish name. Mackenzie? I cannot be certain. Her vagueness was maddening, and Poirot was certain it was deliberate. She was a woman who traded in information, and she was doling it out like precious currency. It was then that the breakthrough came. Inspector Prescott's sergeant, a thorough young man, approached Poirot with a look of triumph. In his search of Julian Fry's belongings, tucked inside a hollowed-out book on art history, he had found a small, sticky pot of glue, a pair of fine tweezers, and a stack of newspapers with specific words neatly cut out. They had found the tools to create the anonymous note. Poirot looked at the evidence, laid out on a linen cloth. It was damning, and yet it was also convenient. Too convenient. The killer had been so clever, so meticulous in staging the locked room and the symbolic mask. Would they be so careless as to hide such incriminating evidence in their own room, where it could be so easily found? It felt like a plant, a piece of stagecraft designed to point a finger. He ordered the immediate detention of Julian Fry. The artist was brought down, spluttering with fury and denial, his protests echoing through the house as he was led to a locked bedroom under guard. The household was in an uproar. The quick solution brought a sense of grim closure to some, like Inspector Prescott, who was ready to wrap up the case. But to Poirot, it felt wrong. The puzzle pieces did not fit together with a satisfying click of truth. They were being forced into a picture that was pleasingly simple, but ultimately false. He stood in the grand hall, watching the dust motes dance in the slanted afternoon light. The arrest of Julian Fry had not brought peace. It had only deepened the mystery. He had followed the threads, and they had led him to a portrait of a liar, a man with motive and now apparent means. But the central question remained. Was Julian Fry a murderer, or was he merely another character in the killer's elaborate, malicious play? The blank mask still stared back at Poirot from his mind's eye, a void that had yet to be filled. The case was not solved. It had merely entered a new, and more deceptive, act. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 5, The prisoner and the puppeteer. A false solution, Poirot knew, was often more dangerous than no solution at all. It bred complacency in the authorities and a treacherous sense of security in the true culprit. The arrest of Julian Fry had cast a pall of uneasy resolution over Blackwater Manor. Inspector Prescott's men grew less vigilant, their posture relaxing now that a suspect was in custody. The guests, while murmuring amongst themselves with a kind of horrified satisfaction, began to speak of packing, of trains back to London, of escaping this house of death. The storm, it seemed, had passed, but Hercule Poirot felt the storm was merely gathering. The evidence against Fry was a neat, tidy package, and that was precisely what offended his sensibilities. The killer had displayed a flair for the dramatic, a psychological cruelty, a mastery of misdirection. To then hide the tools of their crime in so obvious a place was a clumsy, amateurish error. It was a dissonant note in an otherwise meticulously composed symphony of murder. It was, he was convinced, the work of the puppeteer, tying up a marionette and presenting it to the audience as a main actor. He requested to see the prisoner. Fry was held in a spare bedroom on the second floor, a guard stationed outside his door. The artist was a changed man. The brittle arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a raw, trembling fear. He sat on the edge of the narrow bed, his head in his hands. "They think I did it," he whispered as Poirot entered, his voice hollow. "They will hang me for this." "The evidence is most compelling, Monsieur Fry," Poirot stated, not unkindly, but with factual precision. He needed to see the man's reaction, to probe the depths of his despair. "The glue, the tweezers, the newspapers, found in your possession. You had a motive, the affection of Lady Celia and the removal of a disapproving husband. It is a story a jury will understand." "It's a lie," Fry cried out, looking up with desperate, bloodshot eyes. "A frame! I am an artist. Yes, I use glue for my collages, for mounting studies. I have tweezers for handling delicate papers. Those newspapers were for researching current events for a modern piece I am planning. It is all innocent, I swear to you. I did not write that note. I did not kill him." Poirot watched him carefully. The fear seemed authentic, the protestations those of a man caught in a web he did not spin. "Then if you are innocent, who would wish to see you hanged for this crime?" Fry shook his head wildly. "I don't know. Croft? He dislikes me, thinks I'm a parasite. The old woman, Templeton, she has a viper's tongue. The secretary, Digby, he skulks around like a ghost. It could be any of them. Tell me of your movements again. After you left Lady Celia at her door, you say you went to your room to smoke. Did you see anyone? Hear anything? Any small thing, no matter how insignificant?" Fry forced himself to think, his hands clenching and unclenching. I went to my room. It is at the end of the east corridor. I lit a pipe. I was agitated from the evening. I stood by my window, looking out at the gardens. I saw a figure, down below, on the gravel path that circles the house, just for a moment, passing from one pool of shadow to another. Poirot's interest sharpened. A man or a woman? Their costume? "I couldn't tell," Fry admitted, his shoulders slumping in frustration. "It was too dark, and they were gone in an instant. It was just a shape, a fleeting impression. But they were moving quickly, with purpose. It was not much, but it was something. A phantom in the night, a confirmation that someone had been abroad, exploiting the darkness and the distracted alibis of the others." Poirot left the room, his mind whirring. The puppet was protesting his strings. It was time to look again at the puppeteer. He descended to the study, where the body had now been removed, but the chalk outline on the floor and the dark stain on the chair remained, grim reminders of the night's wake. Inspector Prescott was there, looking pleased with himself. "Case closed. I'd say, Monsieur Poirot," he said, puffing out his chest. "Fry had the motive, the opportunity, and we've found the means. Can't ask for much more. Can one not?" Poirot murmured, his eyes scanning the room once more. "The locked door, Inspector. It still puzzles me. How did he leave, bolting it from the inside?" Prescott waved a dismissive hand. "A trick with a string from the window, perhaps? Or he simply bolted it after himself, and the bolt slid back into place when we forced the door. These old locks are often unreliable. Poirot did not argue. He knew it was neither. The bolt was heavy, well made. It had taken significant force to break the door. It had been fully engaged. He walked to the window, unlatching it and looking out. The drop to the manicured shrubbery below was a clear 20 feet. No ledge, no drain pipe. A jump would have been risky, noisy, and would have left clear signs in the soft earth. There were none. His gaze traveled around the room, over the bookshelves, the paintings, the hearth. He stopped. The fire that had been laid but not lit. He had retrieved the note from there. He looked at the logs, arranged in a neat pyramid, and then he saw it. What he had missed before, his attention captured by the crumpled paper. One of the logs, a thick piece of oak, had a long, fresh scratch along its side, a deep, unnatural gouge in the wood. He knelt, his heart beating a little faster. He examined the scratch. It was not a random mark. It was deliberate. Using his penknife, he carefully probed the back of the hearth. His blade tipped caught on something metallic. He pried it gently, and a small, twisted piece of wire, no longer than his thumb, came loose. It was a fragment of a picture-hanging wire, strong and flexible. A theory, audacious and precise, began to form in his mind. The locked room was not an impossibility. It was an illusion, a simple, mechanical illusion. He pictured the bolt on the door. He pictured this wire, looped around it, fed through the keyhole and then, crucially, down under the door and across the floor to the hearth. The killer could have left the room, pulled the wire from outside, sliding the bolt home from the far side of the door. Then, one sharp, final pull would have dragged the wire free, through the keyhole and across the room, where it was retrieved by pulling it into the fireplace, its passage hidden by the carpet pile. The scratch on the log was a mark of its final, violent extraction. It was brilliant in its simplicity. It required no complex apparatus, just a length of wire and a steady nerve. And it explained why the killer had chosen this room, this bolt. It was a trick that relied on a specific type of lock. He stood up, the piece of wire held carefully in his handkerchief. The puppeteer had not vanished into thin air. They had used a tangible tool and left a tangible trace. The blank mask, the cryptic note, the framed suspect. It was all a performance designed to distract from the practical, mechanical cleverness of the crime. He now had two crucial new pieces, Fry's testimony of a shadowy figure outside and the mechanism for the locked room. The focus of the investigation shifted dramatically. It was no longer about who had the most obvious motive to kill Sir Reginald. It was about who had the knowledge, the coolness, and the access to set up such an elaborate scheme. The killer was not a passionate lover or a frustrated businessman. They were a planner, a strategist, and they were still in the house, watching, no doubt satisfied that their puppet was dancing perfectly on the gallows scaffold. But Hercule Poirot had just found one of the strings. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 6, The Sins of the Father. The discovery of the wire in the hearth was a key that unlocked the impossible. The locked room was a lie, a clever contraption of string and misdirection. This knowledge filled Hercule Poirot not with triumph, but with a cold, clear certainty. The killer was not Julian Fry, the passionate artist caught in a web of his own emotions. The killer was a calculator, a person of immense patience and cold intellect, who had planned this night not as a crime of passion, but as an execution, a theatrical settling of accounts. With the mechanics of the murder now clear, Poirot's mind turned fully to the motive. The note had spoken of the past, of a debt. Madame Petrova had hinted at a ruined partner from South Africa. This was a rotten coup. He needed to pierce the veil of Sir Reginald's respectable present and unearth the sins of his youth. He decided to bypass the guarded guests and go directly to the source, Sir Reginald's private papers. With Inspector Prescott's somewhat reluctant authority, he and the inspector conducted a thorough search of the study, now free of its grim chalk outline. They combed through ledgers, correspondence files, and personal documents. It was amidst a box of old, yellowed letters and dried-out fountain pens, items seemingly deemed too insignificant for current affairs, that Poirot found his Rosetta Stone. It was a bundle of letters, tied with a faded ribbon, postmarked from Cape Town, South Africa, dated over 25 years earlier. They were not from a business partner. They were from a woman. Her name was Eleanor Visser. The letters told a poignant and ultimately damning story. A young Reginald Blackwater, then just Reginald Blake, had been a junior partner in a diamond trading concern with Eleanor's father, a kind-hearted man named Jacob Visser. Reginald, charismatic and ambitious, had not only wooed Eleanor but had, through her, gained her father's implicit trust. The letters chronicled a betrayal. Reginald had embezzled a fortune, manipulated ownership documents, and framed Jacob for the financial irregularities that ensued. The company collapsed. Jacob Visser, his reputation in tatters, took his own life. Reginald Blake, with his stolen capital, returned to England a wealthy man, changed his name to Blackwater, and built his empire on the ruins of the Visser family. The final letter was from a heartbroken Eleanor, written after her father's death. The last line was seared into Poirot's mind. "You have taken everything from us, Reginald, but a child carries the truth in its blood. Your debt is not forgotten, and it will be called due." A child. The pieces, once a chaotic jumble, now began to fly together, clicking into place with an audible snap in Poirot's orderly mind. Arthur Digby was Sir Reginald's secret son, but his mother was a local woman, not Eleanor Visser. This was a different child. A child born in South Africa. A child who would have been raised on a story of betrayal and ruin. A child who would have carried that truth, that burning need for reckoning, their entire life. He looked up at Inspector Prescott, his eyes gleaming. "Inspector, we have been looking at the wrong generation. The motive is not in this house's present, but in its deep past. The killer is not a spurned artist or a rival businessman. The killer is a child of South Africa." He summoned the household to the drawing room once more. The mood was different now. The easy relief that had followed Fry's arrest was gone, replaced by a renewed, deeper anxiety. Poirot stood before them, the bundle of letters in his hand. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "I have spoken of the past. I have spoken of a debt. I now know the nature of that debt. It was a debt of honor, of life, of family's happiness, owed to a man named Jacob Visser of Cape Town." He saw the reaction he was looking for. Not a gasp, not a cry, but a subtle, profound stillness that settled over two people in the room. Arthur Digby, who had known a fraction of the secret, looked confused, but Madame Petrova and J.P. Croft, they became like statues. Poirot continued, recounting the story of the betrayal, the embezzlement, the suicide. He held up the final letter. Eleanor Visser wrote of a child who would carry the truth. That child is here, in this room. They have been here all along, waiting, planning this night of the masquerade, a perfect metaphor for the false face of Reginald had shown the world for decades. His eyes swept over them, finally coming to rest on the imposing figure of J.P. Croft. "You, Monsieur Croft, you profess to be an American industrialist, but your knowledge of shipping routes and mergers is a little too convenient, is it not? A perfect pretext to get close to Sir Reginald. Your bluster is a mask, hiding a cold and patient purpose. Are you the son of Jacob Visser? Did you come here for your reckoning?" Croft's face was a mask of stone. "That is a preposterous libel. Poirot, I am John Percival Croft, from Boston. You can check my credentials." "Credentials can be forged," Poirot said softly. "But a mother's letters, they hold a truth that cannot be faked." Then he turned his gaze to Madame Petrova. She met his look unflinchingly, her dark eyes filled with a strange, ancient sorrow. Or perhaps, madam, the child was not a son. Perhaps Eleanor Visser had a daughter who grew up, married, perhaps took a Russian name for disguise, and learned the art of mystery and secrets. A daughter who insinuated herself into this household, not as a business associate, but as a confidant, a collector of secrets, waiting for the perfect moment to destroy the man who destroyed her family. For a long moment, Madame Petrova said nothing. The silence in the room was absolute. Then she gave a slow, sad smile. "You are a very clever man, Monsieur Poirot, but you are only half right." She rose to her feet, her bearing regal. "I am not the daughter. Eleanor Visser was my aunt. The daughter, her name was Katerina. She was my cousin, and she was as much a victim of Reginald Blackwater as my uncle was." She looked not at Poirot, but at a point across the room, her voice dropping to a whisper. The child she speaks of in her letter, the child who carries the truth in its blood, it is not me. A new, shocking understanding dawned on Poirot. He followed her gaze. She was not looking at J.P. Croft. She was looking at the fragile, grieving figure of Lady Celia Blackwater. The child, Madame Petrova said, her voice clear and resonant in the stunned silence, was a girl. She was raised by a heartbroken mother in poverty, while her father built his empire in England. When her mother died, she was determined to find him, not for love, for justice. She was beautiful and clever. She made it her mission to meet him, to charm him, to make him fall in love with her. She became his wife. She has been living as his judge, jury, and now his executioner. Every eye in the room turned to Lady Celia. The fragile nymph was gone. The look of profound grief was still on her face, but it was now layered with something else, a terrifying, steely resolve. She did not deny it. She simply looked back at Poirot, and in her eyes he saw the culmination of a 25-year-old plan. The past had not just come to collect its debt. It had merited, lived with it, and finally, on a night of masked and revelry, had plunged a dagger into its heart. The killer was not in a locked room upstairs. She was sitting in their midst, the grieving widow, the most perfect mask of all. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 7. The Unmasking. A silence as deep and heavy as the tomb descended upon the drawing-room of Blackwater Manor. It was not the silence of shock, but of a terrible, dawning comprehension. All eyes were fixed on Lady Celia. The illusion of the grieving widow, so carefully maintained, shattered like fine glass under the weight of Madame Petrova's accusation. The fragile posture straightened. The look of vapid sorrow dissolved from her features, replaced by an expression of cold, clear defiance. She did not weep. She did not protest. She simply looked from Madame Petrova to Hercule Poirot, and a faint, chilling smile touched her lips. "So," she said, her voice no longer a fluttering soprano, but a low, steady contralto. "The great Hercule Poirot, you have pulled on the thread, and the entire tapestry has unraveled." She smoothed the black silk of her dress, a gesture of fastidious control that reminded Poirot strikingly of himself. "Yes, I am Katharina Visser, the daughter of the man Reginald Blackwater murdered as surely as if he had held a pistol to his head himself." Poirot felt a profound and weary sadness settle upon him. He had hunted the truth, but the truth, now laid bare, was a tragic and ugly thing. He took a small step forward, becoming the center of the room's gravity once more. "The pieces, they now arranged themselves with a terrible clarity," he began, his voice soft but penetrating. "You did not come to this house as a predator stalking its prey. You came as a ghost, the living embodiment of sin he thought buried in another hemisphere. Your beauty was your weapon, your youth your disguise. You made him love you. You became the crowning jewel of his stolen empire. And all the while, you waited. The anonymous letters you yourself sent, they were not just threats. They were a part of the torture. You wanted him to feel the past closing in, to keep him off balance, to make him fearful even in his own home." Lady Celia, Katharina, nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "He deserved to feel fear. The same fear my grandfather felt when he saw his life's work destroyed. The same fear my mother felt when she was left with nothing but a child and a story of betrayal. And so you planned your reckoning for the masquerade," Poirot continued. "A night of masks where you could move unseen. It was you, was it not, who slipped a final note into his belt, a note you had crafted with tools you later planted in Monsieur Fry's room. You knew of his affection for you. You knew he would be the perfect suspect, the passionate, jealous artist. It was a piece of stage management, brilliant and cruel." He turned to address the whole room, explaining the mechanics of her plot. "After the unmasking, you retired to your room, but you did not stay. You slipped out, perhaps through a servant's staircase. You retrieved the dagger from a display in the ballroom, a symbolic touch, to kill him with his own prized possession. You went to his study. He was agitated, disturbed by your note. He let you in. Why would he not admit his own wife, who had come to offer comfort? Poirot painted the scene for them. You spoke to him. You told him the truth, who you were, why you had come. And then, when the shock had rendered him immobile, you struck. One single, brutal thrust. You then placed a blank mask upon his chest. A final statement. You were erasing him, reducing the great Reginald Blackwater to a faceless nothing, just as he had tried to erase your family. He then produced a small, twisted piece of wire from his pocket. And then, the masterstroke, the locked room. You had prepared this in advance. A simple length of picture wire, looped through the keyhole and around the bolt. You pull the wire from the outside, sliding the bolt home. One sharp tug, and the wire was dragged free, snaking under the door and across the carpet, where you retrieved it by pulling it into the fireplace, leaving only a scratch on a log as a trace of its passage. You are a woman of patience and precision. You even thought to use Monsieur Fry's fleeting glimpse of a figure outside to reinforce the idea of an external threat, while you were already safely back inside the house, returning to your room to assume the role of the horrified wife. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and admiration for the sheer, audacious scope of her plan. You framed Julian Fry not only with the tools, but by manipulating his emotions all along, encouraging his attachment, knowing it would make him appear guilty. You used everyone. Madame Petrova, your own cousin, was your eyes and ears, feeding you information and dropping hints about the past to see who might react. You even used the sharp eyes of Mrs. Templeton, planting the scissors with a blue feather to create another red herring, another suspect to confuse the issue. Katerina Visser listened to this meticulous reconstruction of a crime with an air of detached pride. You see it all, don't you, Monsieur Poirot? You see the years of planning, the humiliation of letting that man touch me, the agony of listening to him boast of his wealth, a wealth that was built on my family's bones. It was not murder. It was an execution. It was justice. Non, madam, Poirot said, his voice firm and grave. It was not justice. It was vengeance. And in the eyes of the law, it is murder. You have taken the law into your own hands. You have become the very thing you sought to destroy, a destroyer of lives. You have not only killed Reginald Blackwater, you have condemned an innocent man, Julian Fry, to the gallows. However justified your hatred, you have crossed a line from which there is no return. The raw truth of his words seemed to finally pierce her icy composure. A flicker of uncertainty, of human fear, showed in her eyes. She had been so consumed by her mission of vengeance that she had blinded herself to the moral abyss into which she was stepping. Inspector Prescott, who had been listening with his mouth agape, finally found his voice. Lady Celia, Katerina Visser, I am arresting you for the murder of Sir Reginald Blackwater. Anything you say. She waved a dismissive hand, cutting him off. The regal posture returned for a moment. Spare me your official jargon, Inspector. She looked at Poirot one last time. You have your truth. My mother can rest now. The debt is paid. As Inspector Prescott led her away, the room remained in a state of stunned paralysis. The performance was over. The final mask had been removed, revealing not a monster, but a tragically damaged human being, a victim who had transformed herself into an avenger, and in doing so, had annihilated herself as surely as she had her target. Hercule Poirot did not feel triumphant. He felt old. He had restored order. He had saved an innocent man. He had laid bare the facts. But he was left with a bitter aftertaste of a tragedy that had begun a quarter of a century ago in a sun-scorched country, a tragedy whose final, bloody act had played out in an English manor house on a night of music and masks. Justice, he reflected, was a cold comfort when the cost was so many ruined souls. The case was solved, but the victory felt hollow. Murder at the Masquerade Ball, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Part 8. The echo in the silence. The departure of Katerina Visser, no longer Lady Celia, from Blackwater Manor was a subdued, funereal affair. There were no hysterics, no dramatic proclamations. She walked with a steady tread between Inspector Prescott and his sergeant, her head held high, a queen exiting a conquered kingdom that had turned to ash in her mouth. The slam of the official motorcar door was a final, percussive full stop to the tragic saga. The house itself seemed to let out a long-held breath, the grandeur of its rooms now feeling hollow, a painted backdrop after the actors had departed the stage. In the drawing room, the remaining guests were like survivors of a shipwreck, huddled and shaken on the shore of a new, uncomfortable reality. Julian Fry had been released, the charges against him formally dropped. He stood by the fireplace, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions, relief at his freedom, shame at his own knavery, and a lingering, horrified fascination with the woman who had so coolly manipulated him as a pawn in her game of vengeance. Arthur Digby looked more lost than ever, the secret of his own pality now dwarfed by the epic tragedy of his father's true past. Mrs. Templeton sat stiffly, her sharp eyes softened by a rare and genuine pity, while J.P. Croft merely looked sobered, the bluster knocked out of him by the revelation of such profound, generational hatred. It was Hercule Poirot who broke the silence. He did not do so with triumph, but with the quiet authority of a surgeon who has completed a difficult operation, aware that the patient may never truly heal. "The affair, it is concluded," he began, his hands folded over his waistcoat. "But the human heart, it demands more than a simple conclusion. It demands understanding. And so, with your permission, I will now arrange the facts not as an accusation, but as a story. For that is what this has been, a story written in grief and enacted with terrible patience." He moved to the center of the room, becoming the focal point for their collective need for closure. It began not in this room, and not last night, but 25 years ago in Cape Town. A young, ambitious man named Reginald Blake saw a path to wealth and took it, trampling a good man and his family without a second thought. He believed the past could be buried, its echoes silenced by a new name and a fortress of money. But the past is a seed, and from the seed of Jacob Visser's ruin, a single, determined flower grew, his granddaughter, Katerina. Poirot painted the picture of her life, a childhood shadowed by loss and a mother's bitterness, a burning desire for a reckoning that became the central purpose of her existence. She was not a common criminal. She was an artist of vengeance. Her canvas was Blackwater Manor, and her paints were the personalities within it. She studied her target. She knew that a simple murder would not suffice. He had to be unmasked, both literally and figuratively. The Masquerade Ball was her chosen stage. The masks were her central metaphor. She would reveal the false face of Reginald Blackwater to the world, and she would do it hidden behind the ultimate disguise, that of his devoted, grieving wife. He then walked them through the mechanics of the night with a chilling clarity. The anonymous notes were her overture, setting the stage, putting him on edge. The final note, slipped to him at the unmasking, was her cue. She retired, but only to prepare. She retrieved the dagger, a symbolic piece of his own ill-gotten treasure. She went to him in his study. Can you imagine the scene? The husband, agitated and fearful. The wife, arriving with an offer of comfort. And then, the unveiling. She would have told him who she was. She would have watched the recognition dawn in his eyes, seen the terror as he understood that the past had not only found him but had shared his bed for years. It was then she struck. The blank mask placed on his chest was a final, contemptuous statement. He was nothing, a faceless entity, his identity and legacy erased. He explained the locked room, holding up the fragment of wire. A simple trick, but one requiring nerve and precision. She created an impossible crime to dazzle and confuse, to make the investigation focus on the how rather than the why. And while we were fascinated by the lockbox, she was busy arranging the suspects outside it. She encouraged Monsieur Fry's affections, creating a perfect, passionate fall guy. She planted the glue and newspapers in his room. She even orchestrated minor distractions, like Mrs. Templeton's scissors, to scatter our attention and create false leads. Poirot's gaze swept over them, resting on each in turn. She used you all. Your secrets, your personalities, your predictable reactions, they were all threads in the tapestry she was weaving. Madame Petrova. He nodded to the Russian woman. You were her confidant, her link to the past, feeding information and watching. You knew, did you not, that the reckoning was coming? Madame Petrova gave a slow, sad nod. I knew she intended to confront him, to ruin him, perhaps. I did not know she intended to kill him. I believed her anger was for a public scandal, not this. And you, Monsieur Digby, Poirot turned to the secretary. Your secret, so large and painful to you, was but a small piece in a much larger game. The telephone call you received was from her. I have no doubt, a disguised voice to send you to the study at the precise moment to discover the body and place you under immediate suspicion. He finally looked at Julian Fry. And you, monsieur, you were the cornerstone of her deception, the jealous artist, a role you played with such admirable, if unconscious, skill. Her manipulation of you was the most cruel, for it was a perversion of genuine affection. A profound silence filled the room as Poirot finished. There was nothing more to say. The puzzle was complete. Every piece had its place. Later, as Poirot stood in the hall, preparing to depart, Inspector Prescott approached him. "A brilliant piece of work, Monsieur Poirot. To see through all that theatre, you saved an innocent man from the gallows." Poirot adjusted his bow tie, a fastidious gesture in the face of such chaos. "I uncovered the truth, Inspector. That is my function. But I do not know if I saved anything of true value tonight. A life was taken. Another life is now forfeit to the law. And many others in this house are wounded, their trust in the world shattered. A long-hidden poison has been drawn from a wound, but the body is left weak and scarred." He stepped out into the cool evening air. The grounds of Blackwater Manor were peaceful, the Thames flowing silently past, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its banks. The masks were put away. The ball was over. Order, of a sort, had been restored. But as Hercule Poirot settled into the motor car that would take him away from this place of ruined lives and buried sins, he felt the weight of the silence that followed the storm. It was an echo of a young girl's grief from a quarter-century past, an echo that had finally, and terribly, found its voice. Justice had been served, but there were no victors, only the living, left to navigate the long, quiet aftermath.